Hey guys, it's Christopher Tom here. So you might be familiar with a recent wave of criticism that has been directed towards H3H3 Productions. In fact, that's probably how a lot of you found this channel, because I made a video discussing my personal opinions on the H3 podcast and what I saw as areas for improvement. While I personally tried to keep my criticism focused on strictly the contents of the podcast itself, a lot of people directed their criticisms towards Ethan's character. Although you can usually make a clear distinction between the content and its creator, this situation is a bit different. Unlike a YouTube video, which is meticulously crafted and produced, a podcast is more free-flowing and spontaneous by its very nature. Many fans of the H3 podcast would say that a big part of its appeal is getting to hear Ethan's unfiltered opinions in a more informal setting. While their main channel's videos are more produced and planned out, the podcast provides a more relaxed setting for Ethan to express himself. But with a shift in mediums always comes a shift in appeal. Podcasts are much longer than normal videos, so the personality of the host is more important. While maintaining a good YouTuber to viewer connection is still important for a YouTube video, it becomes considerably more important in a podcast. After all, you're spending 1 or 2 hours listening to somebody talk compared to a 10-minute video. Therefore, your perception of the host as a person is going to play an important role in how you view the content, and there is going to be some overlap between criticism of character and criticism of content. Eventually, it reached its apex when a YouTuber named Gokanaru came out with a 95-minute video called The Death of H3H3 Productions, Video Vigilante. This video is crucial to understanding the context of the situation and why Ethan is in this position in the first place. I'm not going to summarize the entire video because it's a lot to cover, but some of the main points were about Ethan being hypocritical, throwing others under the bus, spreading misinformation, being arrogant and placing himself above others, mistreating guests such as Jimmy Lee and William Osman, and bullying Shoe Nice. The video blew up and made a lot of people reevaluate what they thought about Ethan. And so recently, Ethan decided to address a lot of people's criticisms of him and his content in a podcast called Why Does Everyone Hate H3H3? As you can see by the like to dislike ratio, the feedback on his response was very mixed. While some people saw it as a good response, others felt like it failed to properly address the issues people had with him. So, did Ethan properly acknowledge criticism, and was his response any good? That's what we're going to look at today. He starts by acknowledging a lot of the general criticisms directed towards him.
What have people been saying about me recently? That I'm a hypocrite, that I prioritize money over everything else, that I've thrown friends under the bus, that I'm ignorant and poorly informed, and spread misinformation, that I'm arrogant, that I cannot handle criticism, and that I've used people, just to name a couple of the reoccurring themes. I'm sure there's so much more you could say about me. And let me just say this, okay, for the record, that I am guilty of all of those things.
Ethan talks about how he did a lot of regrettable things due to his overconfidence, which would then lead to him receiving criticism.
I started to become more arrogant and overconfident, and on some probably deep, unconscious level, a feeling of almost infallibility, that I could take anything on. And so because of this combination of like overconfidence and feeling like I could take everything on, it led me to make a lot of mistakes. And then when I was criticized for those mistakes, then I would act extremely defensive and nasty and not really processing them in a healthy way.
So he'd become increasingly defensive over the criticism, and it would perpetuate this very unhealthy cycle. First of all, I have to give him props for acknowledging a lot of these criticisms, especially considering that he could have just ignored them. And I can definitely respect that he's willing to own a lot of the mistakes that he's made.
Early on in our YouTube career, I went very early on to somebody that was like universally liked. I remember in like 2016, I could do no wrong on YouTube. On Reddit, everybody loved us. People had me very high on a pedestal back then. I mean, people thought very highly of me. And there's no doubt that at the time, it definitely started to go to my head as well.
I can definitely put myself in Ethan's shoes here. You can really only maintain such a high position for so long before you start to make some mistakes. He went from being someone who could do no wrong in 2016 to being the subject of a lot of criticism now. That can be very hard to adapt to, especially if you're used to being on top for so long. Before the podcast, people formed their opinion on Ethan as a person based on the edited version of himself he put out. And when you really get down to it, a lot of the criticisms that have been leveled at Ethan recently have been related to things that have happened on his podcast and not his main channel. And when you're doing a podcast, you're basically putting out hundreds of hours of content on the internet. You're just speaking your mind, so it's pretty inevitable that you're gonna slip up and say something ridiculous eventually. Ethan himself acknowledges this. But back then, he built his fame off of videos on his main channel, so he had an opportunity to edit what he was saying and reflect on it. And that's the thing about making YouTube videos versus podcasts. You get to craft your image more carefully. Because of the level of attention directed towards him and the already high perception people have of Ethan, any mistakes he makes on the podcast are going to be amplified because of his level of influence. And because because of this shift to a looser, more unfiltered format, compounded with the increased possibility of Ethan saying the wrong thing, a lot of people's perceptions of him were shattered. This naturally leads to a certain amount of criticism, which Ethan wasn't used to. So in terms of Ethan's response, it's good that he acknowledged his faults. But one of the main problems people have with how Ethan decided to handle this is the lack of specifics, and I have mixed thoughts about that. With the amount of criticism that Ethan's already facing, it kinda makes sense that he doesn't really want to shine a light on it any further. And it makes sense that he would want to control his image to a certain extent, especially when you consider that there are some people who might not even be aware that this is all going on. But even if you were one of the people who wanted to see him address some of the more specific criticisms, at the very least you could say that he acknowledged the general points people were making. He could have pulled the grade A under A where he just took some of the most bizarre criticisms and attacked those.
Maybe the pedophile!
But he chose to address most of the real issues people had with him, instead of just creating a straw man that he could attack. But with that being said, even if it was understandable why he chose to take this approach, it still would have been way better if he talked about the more specific points people brought up. Here, Ethan briefly mentions the incidents involving Leafy and the Wall Street Journal.
Like, for example, the Leafy thing was, and the Wall Street Journal thing and stuff like this, where I kind of handled things in a really overconfidence, really, thinking that I can take on the world and not do wrong.
While you could pinpoint these as examples of him getting into specifics, he doesn't address some of the more damning points that were brought up against him, such as his treatment of Jimmy Lee or William Osman, or the way he treated Shoe Nice, for example. To be clear, Ethan did apologize and express a desire to improve.
I want to say that if I have disappointed you, I'm sorry. I know I can be better and I want to be better.
That's great. However, an apology to the specific people he wronged would have been even better, especially when you consider that he basically admitted that he threw people under the bus. If you're willing to admit to something like that, you'd might as well just say sorry to them. Of course, it's entirely possible that he did that privately, so I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. There were also some people saying he should have apologized to PewDiePie and JonTron. I understand that Felix and John were both friends of Ethan, and that's a big part of why people were upset with Ethan in the first place, because they saw it as him throwing his friends under the bus. But I feel like when you remove that component of it, then the individual situations become a bit more complex and subjective. You could argue that Ethan didn't actually do anything wrong by being critical of PewDiePie saying the N-word, even if Ethan said it himself. In the context of Felix saying it, it was a slip of the tongue that happened when he got angry in a video game. But when Ethan said it, he was just joking around and talking about a catchphrase with the guy who coined it, iDubbbz. And although the JonTron podcast was really hard to watch and Ethan definitely prodded John too hard, you also have to understand that at the time, Ethan was in a very difficult position and was facing criticism from both sides, and people wanted Ethan to ask tougher questions. So I can understand where Ethan was coming from on both of these situations, but with that being said, he definitely could have went about both situations in a better way. For instance, the way Ethan discussed the PewDiePie controversy kind of hinted that Felix might have been a closet racist. Even if Ethan explicitly said that he doesn't believe Felix is a racist, that's kind of the implication in this clip right here.
I don't think Felix is a racist person, but damn, he really kind of just was really comfortable using that word. That really just kind of, like you're reaching for all these words, right? And you're like, oh, let me just like a little N-bomb for you. I mean, I know this is a point a lot of people say, but it certainly seems like that's not the first time he's used that word in that context.
And although Ethan was facing a lot of pressure to interview John in a certain way, there's no denying that the whole thing was really hard to watch. And Ethan should have just moved on at a certain point, because it was extremely clear just how painful of an experience John was having. Don't get me wrong here, it was pretty messed up, especially when you consider that they were friends. There have been some people saying that Ethan was just pretending to have depression so he could use it to elicit pity and deflect criticism. I don't believe this personally, and I do think that Ethan is being truthful about his struggles with depression. But if Ethan wanted to dispel this theory that he's just using depression as an excuse, then it really would have been beneficial if he got into more specifics. Although he did own up to his mistakes, he spent a lot more time reflecting on his own mental state rather than on his actions. I'm not necessarily suggesting that he was trying to make excuses for his actions, but at the same time, I can understand why other people might think that. We're in a time on YouTube where the viewers want to see more introspection. And while Ethan definitely showed introspection regarding his own personal issues, it would have been more beneficial if he spent more time reflecting on his actions instead. A good example of what I'm getting at would be something along the lines of Elvis the Alien's video, Leafy Revisited, where Elvis looked at a 2-year-old video he made criticizing Leafy and admitted some of the faulty things he said in his original video. Elvis basically responds to some of his own arguments that he made in the past and gives a newer and more mature perspective. It was a fantastic video where Elvis basically reflects on his past and highlights how much his views have changed. Now, this isn't to say that Ethan wasn't reflective at all. He definitely was, and he was more than willing to take a step back and think about the mental state he was in when he made those mistakes. comments. But after he put out this response, a lot of people were under the impression that he was just ignoring a lot of the things that Gokanaru pointed out in his video. If he was dealing with a singular line of criticism, then Ethan's more generalized approach would be fine. But that wasn't the case, because what he was dealing with was a 95-minute video that had a lot to say. Ethan's approach here is like if you had a content cop made on you and you acknowledged all of your general flaws but failed to address anything specific and spent more time talking about the circumstances surrounding your mistakes. Yeah, it's good that you're willing to own up to it, for sure. But in an event like this, you have to go a little deeper than that. People wanted to hear Ethan discuss his treatments of guests like William Osman and Jimmy Lee because they felt like Ethan mistreated them. They wanted to hear Ethan talk about JonTron because they felt like Ethan backstabbed his friend. And it makes complete sense that they wanted to hear Ethan talk about this because as fans, they care about Ethan as a person. And considering that the podcast is now one of his main forms of content, who he is as a person is now more important to the enjoyment of his content than ever before. It's cool that Ethan apologized to anybody he disappointed, but really it's the people he wronged who deserve apologies the most. One of the main points Ethan made in his response was how unwilling he was to accept criticism. So I want to talk about that mindset for a bit, especially since I see these sorts of sentiments being echoed by his fanbase. There seems to be this idea that any criticism of H3H3 is coming from a place of ill will or hatred. If you have some issues with the podcast, you're just being a hater, dude. First of all, the problem with this mindset is that it provides an easy way out of facing criticism. But more importantly, it misses the fact that a lot of the criticism comes from people who genuinely want the best for Ethan and his content. A lot of the people who are voicing their thoughts are or were fans of H3, and the entire purpose of good criticism is so the recipient can use it to improve. And clearly Ethan recognizes its importance on a certain level, otherwise he wouldn't have addressed this in the first place. There's also this idea that criticism isn't valid if it's not coming from somebody with certain credentials. But you don't have to be a chef to criticize food, you don't have to be a filmmaker to criticize bad movies, and you don't have to be a podcaster to recognize that there is room for improvement on the H3 podcast. In fact, I'd say that the audience has every right to criticize what they're watching. After all, the content was made with the idea that there will be an audience watching and commenting on it. Of course, at the end of the day, this doesn't change the fact that ultimately it's the creator who can choose whether or not they want to listen to the criticism and whether or not they think it's valid. And it's completely fine if they disagree. I'm not saying that they have to bend over for every single critic, but it would be beneficial for both parties to be able to draw a distinction between criticism that comes from a place of positive intentions and criticism that comes from a place of malice. There's no denying that there were definitely some people who were spewing hatred, but I believe that a lot of the genuine criticisms that people had for Ethan could act as a blueprint for what he could improve on in the future. There's a lot of people out there who want to see him improve, who want to see him grow, and even if he didn't make any specific apologies, it seems like Ethan wants to change for the better, and I'm hopeful for his content in the future. But for now, only time will tell if Ethan truly improves. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Hope you liked it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.